I went to a law school that my grandfather couldn't go to.
Right.
My mentor graduated from my law school. I went to the University of Miami. They didn't graduate the first black people until the 1970s.
What?
20 years after Brown versus Board, yeah.
Sorry, my brain did not comprehend that. That was a very visceral reaction.
Yeah.
Really?
No, really. This is how it was. So my current mentor, who still practices law, was the fourth black person to graduate University of Miami.
Yeah.
So this isn't history. This is memories. This is current reality. And those barriers have existed. And there's another picture of one of the first black males to go to a white law school. And you literally see him seated outside the classroom because they wouldn't allow him to sit in the classroom.
Wow.
And the lecturers, professors inside the classroom, and everyone's in there. So those same physical barriers may not exist today, but black students are pushed out of the schools and of the classrooms in different ways. Welcome to the Know Your Rights Camp podcast. I'm Amir.
And I'm Dee.
In today's episode, we're going to be talking about some recent reports that look at trends in college enrollment, specifically the trends with black male enrollment dropping significantly. For example, at HBCUs or historic black colleges and universities, black males currently only make up 26% of enrollment. And even back in 1976, black males were about 38%. So although it was not half and half, it was still significantly higher than it is today. And recent reports have highlighted these trends.
We're going to delve into the various reasons why we think this may be, but generally speaking, give us an overview. What are some things that contribute to these lower enrollment rates?
Right. Important to acknowledge two things. College enrollment is dropping across all genders and races. And then also, specifically with males, male enrollment in college has dropped 17% between 2010 and 2021 versus 13% for female enrollment. But specifically with black males, there are systematic barriers very early on that deter and create barriers for access to college. And then also post-secondary opportunities that could include maybe going to the military, going into trade school or different things. But starting as early as 4 years old, black males are significantly more likely to be suspended. Even in preschool, they're more likely to be deprived of their opportunity for education. And then by the time, the students get to high school, they're pushed out or maybe don't see enough positive role models to look like them. So those are some of the reasons, and we're going to dive much deeper.
Yeah.
Not to mention the school to prison pipeline, right? That pushes lots of students out, specifically black males, and into the criminal legal system.
So let's talk about before you're even in high school, before you're even applying to get into college. We're not talking about grades or just extracurriculars. We're talking about early on, there's a perception that black students, male students, are maybe not cut out for education, or a student that maybe appear bored in class, that may be seen as being, not just bored because maybe they're over the material, or maybe because the material doesn't represent them, or maybe the material is something they already know. It can be perceived as acting out.
Right.
And that can lead to disciplinary actions versus somebody who perhaps is not a black man or a black child, a black student. The teacher may look at them and go, oh, maybe they need more attention.
Exactly.
So what we have already is that there's a perception of black male students as not being as engaged. And why do you think that might be?
I mean, that starts very early on. We're socialized to view black males as criminal, to view them as older. Studies show that people can look at a 12-year-old black male versus a 12-year-old white male and overestimate the age of the black male to be 16, 17, to be an adult. You think of the Trayvon Martin situation, right, where you have a teenager that's being perceived as an adult. And research has also shown that teachers can observe behavior that will be similar between black and white students, but with black students, it will be viewed as criminal.
Right.
And even just their attention would be more on the black students. And I actually looked at this issue a lot in my research for my doctoral dissertation. One of the most fascinating studies I saw said that Black boys, when they're about 6 years old, look forward to going to school. But by the time they're in high school, something occurs where they're no longer is interested in going to school, something called academic disengagement, where literally their self-esteem is detached from their achievement. And that only happens with Black males, where, any other group in race, gender, if they receive Fs in school, it'll hurt their self-esteem.
Right.
But with Black boys specifically, you can receive Fs or lower grades and still have a high self-esteem, still feel that different things. And I think that's from a complicated number of reasons.
Right. But I think the general gist about that is there's an expectation that if there's a student, it should be any student isn't doing well, that they receive special attention, that they get sort of catered to, like, how do we make this better?
Right.
But because what you were saying, there is this perception of Black male students not being engaged, or perception that if they're failing, that that's almost what they're supposed to do, that there's no extra help, there's no attention given.
Exactly.
And that probably also stems from the fact that we probably don't see enough Black male teachers.
Oh, yeah. I think Black male teachers about 2% of the workforce, depending on the place and in the state. So they're less likely to see themselves in school. I remember I didn't have my first Black male teacher till about 5th grade. And then even in high school, I didn't have very many. Then at college and university, didn't see many.
Yeah.
But I did have a Black counselor in college that I know, shout out to Brian, who
Yeah.
was there. And shout out to these programs. I was part of a first generation college program called, Educational Opportunity Fund, which unfortunately programs like this are being defunded right now with the current federal government. But this program helped me to prepare for college, because we went to schools that did not prepare us.
Right.
Our schools failed us. I mean, that's why I do civil rights lawyer work today in education, because I have a grudge against my school that set me up for failure.
Right.
I had to do a whole extra year of remedial courses and different things. And, it takes extra time, but with the right care, with the right counseling and support, it's something that we should be able to do.
And that's something that is not just your experience. We're seeing that a lot of schools where the population is primarily people of color, primarily Black, they're not getting the funding they need. They're not getting the resources they need. And by and large, to move ahead in higher education, if that's what you want to do, requires resources. It requires funding, and it requires a whole network. It's not just getting good grades. It's not just being in extracurriculars. That's what they like to tell us. But not everyone has equal footing trying to get into college.
Exactly. And I mean, shout out to Black women too, because I know part of this is that they are excelling and kicking ass so much. It's hard to even compete and stand up. But when you look at the numbers, for example, at Howard University, Black men are only 19% of enrollment at the university. So,
that's a shame.
Yeah, 1 out of every, 5 at that point at a historic Black college where Thurgood Marshall went, where lots of Black scholars and historians went, and now you're very unlikely to see people who look like them.
And something we should make clear is that it's not just that Black men can't get into college. That's actually not even a problem, not the only problem.
Right.
The problem, too, is that once you get into college, there needs to be more attention to retention. I don't think people realize that a lot of people who make it through college do it because there are systems in place to help them.
Right.
There are resources, there are counselors, there are people who look like them that they can turn to. And so we're not seeing a lot of retention when it comes to Black male students.
Right. And even the expectation, people who look like them, or if you're a second or third generation college student, it's already within your culture, embedded within your culture, certain things. You go home, you have your parents helping you move in, you have, these different support networks around you versus first generation. I was actually not just the first person to graduate college, first male to graduate college, but if you look at my male line, like my father and father's father and father's father, going back, I was actually the first to graduate high school.
Wow.
My father was unable to graduate high school. He came up in the 80s with all of that stuff happening and didn't make it. Grandfather didn't graduate high school, actually grew up, you know, picking cotton and in the South where it was common, but he was able to get a job at factories in, you know, in the 1950s and 60s. But his father didn't graduate high school. And then before that, it was literally illegal for you to be black and have an education. So despite my family being here for over 200 years, I'm the first to graduate high school as a male, and it's not an uncommon thing. I think I didn't know that until a history project in my undergrad where I actually looked into my family history. But I'm sure if other people look into their family histories, they would find something similar. So it's not just first college attending, but it's sometimes first high school graduating.
I know it's bittersweet, but congratulations.
Thank you. I appreciate it. No, but real talk, that was the motivation. Once I got my first degree, I was like, just get a couple more, and 5 degrees later, But one of them specifically, like I mentioned, my doctoral research looked at Black male achievement, specifically in South Central LA, and what were some of the contributing factors to quote unquote academic success of Black men, because you see disparities, gender disparities, as early as 3rd grade. They say the very first test scores, you see women or girls having higher scores than boys. You see what they say, the attention of boys is less than girls. They say, the ability to sit still and different things. But I mean, that also relates to specifically with Black males being disproportionately placed in special education and diagnosed with different learning disabilities. There have been some studies that showed literally the same activity and behavior. It can occur in a Black person and a white person and be judged differently. With one group, it could be judged as being gifted and talented, that the student is attentive and engaged. But with the Black male student, they would be called hyperactive or always raising their hand, always standing up, and different things. So race frames the way we interpret behavior. And
so does gender. And so if you have sort of the double whammy of being Black and male as a student, where people perceive, inattention or maybe hyperactivity as negative as opposed to something that, like, how can we work with them?
Exactly.
Then you're sort of already put at a disadvantage.
And something for sure that I know is a barrier, I saw this with some of my friends, and thankfully the law has changed in recent years, but when I was in college, you could lose your financial aid for having a drug charge.
Wow.
That was literally one of the only reasons why. And we know who gets drug charges disproportionately.
Right, that seems a little too specific to a stereotype.
Right. Wait, so you mean, what about arson or kidnapping?
Yeah, or maybe just any general felony.
Any general felony. No, you would lose your financial aid if you had a drug charge. And I remember several of my friends lost their financial aid and opportunity to have college paid for because of that.
That's a shame. And also it shows that it's so specifically worded and it's so coded.
Right.
And so talking about coded, sometimes we see coded curriculum, right? It's hard to be engaged if the curriculum that you are forced to engage with doesn't include you, doesn't reflect you, isn't written by you. Do you think that's something that affects people's ability to sort of see the need for higher education or the worth?
Absolutely. Engagement. I mean, thankfully, I found Malcolm X's autobiography that helped me see myself and value education. But my high school experience, I didn't see anyone who looked like me in the books. And that made education, something else that I wasn't interested in, because, again, I need to see a mirror, not a window. I need to see myself. And why would you pursue, something that doesn't value you or affirm who you are?
Speaking of that, there's a lot of fixation in higher education, in academia in general, about individualism. The idea is that you need to be better than the person to the left, to the right, that somehow your scores, your ability to succeed means having to beat out everybody else.
Right.
But if you're already isolated as a student of color, especially isolated as a Black male student who doesn't have the resources or the sort of community behind you, it can be especially hard to muddle through higher education. And so there's been this idea that we need to create a system for ourselves, students for themselves, to create that village.
Oh, yeah.
So when you talk about retention, sometimes it's not asking the university or the college to create that for them. It's to create it for themselves.
Exactly.
Did you have any of that when you were in college?
Yeah, I found my camaraderie. I'm a musician, so, at all of my colleges, I hung with a group of musicians, whether we would play for the gospel choir or whatever, sometimes doing intramural sports, could create community. And in the early 1900s, at universities, Black men and women came together to create those communities through creating Black Greek organizations.
Yeah.
You know, the Omega Psi Phis and the Alphas and the Kappas. I didn't do that. It was a little too expensive for me to pledge, and I didn't have the time or the money. But they create that sense of community, of support that's needed, and that wasn't from the university. That was organically. You know, we keep ourselves supported. We have to do it for ourselves. No one's coming to save us. So you have people like W.B. Du Bois and Martin Luther King Jr.'s who were alphas, and, you know, lots of athletes who were Omega Psi Phis, whether it's, you know, Shaquille O'Neal, Michael Jordan, and others. Like, most Black men, or I don't want to say most, I haven't looked at the numbers, but a large number of Black men will pledge some fraternity to find more people who look like them and find a community.
Sure. You know, I just have to say, a lot of people of color took inspiration from the Black fraternities and sororities. And I just remember on campus seeing the multicultural fraternities and sororities and seeing the impacts they have on the different students. I worked with students in college, and I could see how being around people who are going through what you're going through, not necessarily because you come from the same socioeconomic background, because you have the same face, but because you're having the same experience, is super helpful. And so we find that when it comes to a lot of retention projects on campuses, because they're student initiated, that they don't necessarily get university support.
Exactly.
Do you see a future where there's university support, or do you think that the best way to go about this for those listening who are students is to keep forming their own groups, keep finding their own people?
Well, the students, the people have to take care of themselves and have to do it and protect themselves. And unfortunately, right now, we're in a climate where the federal government is threatening universities, saying if you have a DEI program, if you even have scholarships, they're saying, you're seeing some universities take away scholarships from specific students, even like scholarships that have been around for 100 years, the NAACP scholarship or the Historic Black College Fund. That Trump himself donated to, you know? But now this administration is attacking these programs that create access and support. Like, I wouldn't be here without those support and scholarships. And many other students really depend on them. So there is a deliberate attack on them. So we have to create our own supports for each other, but it costs money, it costs time, it costs resources. Students shouldn't have the burden of supporting other students, right? We pay tax dollars, we pay tuition to get services. That's what that money is supposed to go to.
Supposed to,
You know, but you have colleges with these multi-billion-dollar endowments that aren't further investing them in students. And that's why you're seeing this. I mean, even at some of the historic Black colleges and universities, I remember at Howard a few years ago, students were protesting and, you know, fighting for more access. And at lots of universities, I remember at Berkeley a few years ago, the students got together and organized to create a center to support Black students. And that was just established, I think, maybe 15 years ago or something like that. So I think it's a combination of both.
So we talked a little bit about the support system you had. What would be your advice as a Black man to another Black man who's going through trying to figure out higher education, trying to figure out high school, middle school even, just trying to figure out their place in academia?
Right. I would say try to find those programs, although they're diminishing, but they're programs to support you, you know. I had to have some cultural shifts in my relationship to books and education because I was a knucklehead. I wasn't always studying. That's why I had to start at a community college first and, you know, undo some of the bad habits in terms of test preparation and even test anxiety, you know, just knowing that you have to go into, you know, that environment with a chill mind, you know, that's a skill you have to develop but it's something you hear about in music and in songs. You know, I always think of the Tupac song. He said, and Dear Mama, he said, who think in elementary, hey, I'd see the penitentiary one day, you know? He's saying in elementary, you didn't foresee all the barriers and different things that would lead you on the path to prison. You had that optimism and different things. But also in the same song, he talked about, you know, being suspended from school with the big boys breaking all the rules, you know. So Pac always held those contradictions, right?
Right.
But that's what it is to be a Black male in today's society, right? You almost can't smile. I know a lot of friends who literally just don't smile because we have this stern I will say some of it is toxic idea of masculinity,
Sure.
and oftentimes that does not include value in education.
And it probably doesn't include value in education because education didn't value black men to begin with.
Right.
So let's make sure we understand that it started that way and not any other way.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. I mean, it was illegal for my ancestors to learn to read, literally punishable by death.
Right.
And you know, I went to a law school that my grandfather couldn't go to.
Right.
My mentor graduated from my law school. I went to the University of Miami. They didn't graduate the first black people until the 1970s.
What?
20 years after Brown versus Board, yeah.
Sorry, my brain did not comprehend that. That was a very visceral reaction.
Yeah.
Really?
No, really. This is how it was. So my current mentor, who still practices law, was the fourth black person to graduate University of Miami.
Yeah.
So this isn't history. This is memories. This is current reality. And those barriers have existed. And there's another picture of one of the first black males to go to a white law school. And you literally see him seated outside the classroom because they wouldn't allow him to sit in the classroom.
Wow.
And the lecturers, professors inside the classroom, and everyone's in there. So those same physical barriers may not exist today, but black students are pushed out of the schools and of the classrooms in different ways.
And I think something we need to be really aware of is that we need to dissuade ourselves from the notion that just because, great, you had the first few black men to graduate in 1970, that just because you hit a milestone, that was enough.
Right.
Right? I think what happens, and it's easy, is that schools will push for just enough representation and diversity, but they don't push for the equity and the inclusion.
Right.
And so I think that when we talk about these things today, especially with DEI, where it is now, which is completely being thrown out the window, that we remember that just because there are some that have made it, that there are so many more that may not.
Right.
Because if the trend is going in the direction it's going in, that we may find ourselves in situations just like 1970, where we might find that we don't even have enough people in the school to graduate.
Right.
And so, we look at what it is now, we looked at what it is in the past, but going forward, we need to realize that we're not that far ahead from where we were before, and that there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, and in some ways, we're actually
going backwards. Yeah.
I think schools like UCLA that just have 3% black folks, it probably was a little higher in the 1970s before Proposition 209 and other things. And it's a more competitive world today.
Yeah.
To graduate high school and get into a university takes higher GPA, higher SAT scores or ACT scores.
And a lot of what they look at, SAT scores, GPAs, which are by and large inflated, again, come from schools with resources.
Right.
They come from schools that are not just high schools, but college preparatory academies, schools where people have the privilege of choosing which school they're going to go to versus hoping to get in. And so I think another trend that we're seeing is that it's making it harder for folks who are already disadvantaged because of the way they're perceived in the classroom, because of the resources they don't have, realizing that now they're going up against hyper competitive students who come from these overly privileged, dare I say, high schools.
Right.
And it's not those students' fault, but the problem is that we're not spreading our resources out.
Exactly. Like I worked for ACLU SoCal, and about 20 years ago, we filed a case here in California challenging the fact that in Inglewood, students only had access to 2 AP or advanced placement courses compared to Beverly Hills High School, where students had over 20. Both public schools, funded with public dollars.
Not that far apart,
technically. About 10, 15 miles apart, right? But a student who attends one has a significantly higher GPA because when you take an AP course,
you get the extra GPA points.
It's inflated to, literally inflates your GPA. So the system itself was disadvantaging students.
Right.
And as a result of this lawsuit, the state of California then did some reforms, and supposedly it was supposed to put billions of dollars into creating more access and equity. So now at Inglewood High School, they do have more courses there today. But now we're dealing with school closures and other things in the districts where they're literally turning the high school campuses into luxury housing
Yeah.
that the students and their families can't afford. And there's that sort of humiliation and other stuff going on. So the system itself does play a role in creating these inequalities.
Yeah, and what we'll see is Inglewood High School probably got maybe 5 more AP classes, 7
Right.
AP classes, but I bet you Beverly Hills also did.
Oh, yeah, Beverly Hills
And
probably has
so
over 30.
they probably have over 30, and so people think that you need to dole out resources equally, or they don't want to dole out resources equally. And yet, when all people are asking is for the equity, which, is a word that a lot of people don't understand, but it's
Right.
just basically being at the same amount of resources, the same level, same starting point as everyone else, it becomes this huge topic about, is it reverse racism? Is it giving people an extra boost that didn't necessarily, acting as if there are other students who didn't already get an extra boost.
Right.
And so,
Literally.
it just becomes a weird sort of, people can't seem to focus on the fact that people are not at the same starting point.
Right.
And so you
Never.
can't dole out resources equally. You need to dole them out equitably.
Equitably to address historical harms.
Mhm.
There has always been white affirmative action
Sure.
in this country. I mean, look
Right.
at the Trump administration and the number
Yeah.
of white men he's appointed
Right.
in his roles. But like I said, my mentor who couldn't go to the college I attended in the 1970s, but even going back further to that, there were all of these preferences for white students. Literally no black students being admitted into
Yeah.
lots of universities, or very few token amounts. And
Yeah.
now we're going back to that, unfortunately, because there is an attack. Actually, just last week, the federal government sent a letter to every university, every college, and also all the K through 12 schools, telling them to eliminate DEI programs, which under their very broad
Could be anything.
literally a scholarship for black students is DEI, and
It could also work in reverse if they have an English program where they think too many of the books are written by authors who are people of color
Or
or
non-white.
from the LGBT or just non-white and not
Yeah.
non-hetero cis
Yeah.
men or women, then that could be considered a DEI program, and then there goes your learning.
Right. So there's an attack on the little bit that existed. And unfortunately, you're seeing universities retreat from this. You're seeing schools, I don't know if it was Jacksonville or somewhere, I think it was in Florida, where they usually have a historic Black College University Day parade. And this year, the city didn't grant them the permit to attend it. Because of this climate that we have currently, they feel justified, and they feel like, well, we don't have to make space for you all to have historic Black colleges and universities. Where let's acknowledge the truth. The reason why we have HBCUs in the first place is because they wouldn't let Black people into other universities.
Right.
So, universities specifically for Black people emerged, and throughout the years, over a century, different traditions have emerged, and like whether it's the drum line and the bands and different Greek stepping and all of this things that are now part of American culture. And you have over 100 universities, historic Black colleges and universities, but now they're trying to defund them and push people away more. And that's going to drive the disparities even more with lower numbers of Black males.
Right. I read this statistic that if we want to look at the wage gap between Black and white people, you have to first look at Black men versus white men. And when it comes to that, the fact that a lot of Black men, the fact that a lot of opportunity is tied to a college degree,
Right.
which is a conversation in and of itself, because that's just where we are right now. Everything is tied to a college degree. The fact that a lot of Black men aren't able to get that degree, whether because they can't get into the university or because there's no retention, what we're seeing is that we're not going to see much of a change in the wage gap between Black and white people.
Yeah.
Because it does start with looking at Black men and women. And so, Black men and white men. So there we see the ramifications. I think some people think like, oh, well, there's others. It's probably something that's told to a lot of Black men is, oh, well, you can go to trade school.
Right.
You can go to the army. You can go to, you could do this, anything but that. Whereas if somebody else who's not a Black man says, well, I'm not sure, here are resources.
Right.
Right. And so there are ramifications outside of just getting a degree. It's looking at wage gaps. It's looking at access to opportunity, and it's looking at families in general.
Yeah, no, it has a broad impact.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw that Harvard study. It shared that basically the gap between black and white is because of men, specifically. And until we invest in families and have these scholarships and have these opportunities, we're going to see it continue to grow, unfortunately.
Right. And with the state of everything now, it seems like the fight to make sure that we're creating these opportunities falls on us. And by us, I mean those of us not in power.
Right.
Not in traditional power.
Yeah. And there are a lot of initiatives specifically for black men. Like I know different cities have this initiative called 100 Black Men or Black Men in Suits. And different fraternities have mentoring programs where they try to expose, boys, young black boys to college. And, there are lots of things, but we need a lot more. We need funding and support for it. We need, assistance. We need these things to be institutionalized.
Right.
So to wrap us up, I want to share a statistic that comes from my research, my doctoral dissertation, over 15 years ago when I did it, and then look at the updated statistic from today. So when I did my research, only 1 out of every 9 black males in Los Angeles were qualified for the state universities to attend them, based off the coursework they're completing. Because you have to take a certain amount of English courses, mathematics courses, arts,
certain
and different
units,
things, certain units. Only 1 out of every 9 black men, about 15 years ago when I started my research. But now that number is more than tripled to over 30% of black men are now qualified for the UCs and the Cal States. However, if you look at other races, it's upwards of 70, 80%. So although the number has tripled, it can increase a lot more, and we have to create more programs to support black boys, starting in kindergarten where they're 4 times as likely to be suspended, up to high school where they're more likely to maybe have athletics and other things taking up their time. So we have to create those supports. And then, as we mentioned too, we have to have those retention programs once they actually get to college.
So it takes a village.
It takes a village.
It takes a village. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Know Your Rights Camp podcast. Be sure to check us out online at knowyourrightscamp.org.